Hey, what's poetry for? What should it do for a reader? Let's discuss. Let's start with Horace. Could start anywhere really, but we'll start with Horace and his Ars Poetica. He says it's not enough that poems be beautiful, let them be tender and affecting, and bear away the soul of the auditor. Meaning, poems shouldn't just read well or be contain a great artifice. They should transport. They should let us experience this kind of echoing back to the Greeks and Aristotle, this catharsis, where you kind of experience tragedy and you have this great release of your emotions. And that's clearly a big value to Horace. Okay? Let's bear that in mind. It's not enough just to write well. Okay? Here we move on to Sir Philip Sidney. He's responding to kind of these puritanical criticisms of the theater and poetry in general that people involved, students especially involved in theatrical productions, are becoming kind of debauched and they're not learning how to behave morally, and the theater is misleading them. He writes poetry, poesy, as he says, therefore is an art of imitation, which is echoing Aristotle there. For so Aristotle terms it in his own words, mimesis, that is to say, a representing, counterfeiting, or figuring forth. To speak metaphorically, a speaking picture with this end, to teach and delight. So this quote, to teach and delight, we see echoed again and again as a kind of formula for what poetry is and what it does, or what its duties are at least. But in this whole context, he's in some ways resituating and reframing this Greek ideal. And he's talking about this, how poetry could be like a mirror in the way that representative art could be. And in showing us something about the world we live in or about ourselves, it could help us, it could both delight us and we could learn at the same time. Now we move warp speed to this period of industrialization. Society is changing very quickly. A lot of people are concerned with making money and achieving material advantage, probably because for many classes of people, this is a new possibility. So if you used to be essentially a farm laborer for life, you had other possibilities. A lot of them end up being pretty grim. Let's see how Wordsworth responds to the situation of a society collectively looking to pursue wealth and increase wealth. The poet writes under one restriction only, namely the necessity of giving immediate pleasure, which is what we're talking about here, to a human being. Okay? Not in the way that a lawyer, physician, or a mariner does, or an astronomer, or a natural philosopher, but as a man. So Wordsworth wants to contrast the way in which knowledge or pleasure is conveyed by other specialists, people who have specific fields of knowledge, to a poet who therefore has no specific field of knowledge except perhaps the knowledge of people themselves. We could say that this idea for Wordsworth that poetry should only be about pleasure is provocative, because most people would say at this time the pursuit of pleasure is the pursuit of wealth, which you could then use to purchase pleasure, to purchase things that are enjoyable. Wordsworth is saying, if it's not found directly in nature, in direct engagement with nature, the type of pleasure it's going to give you probably is not super useful to you. So this is almost a kind of bohemian reaction against the materialism of his time. Okay? Let's go on. I threw Dostoevsky in here, not because Dostoevsky is a poet per se, but because this Notes from the Underground influenced so many people. And as a result, kind of the portrait of a contemporary person's psyche in rebellion has changed the game so much. In despair, there are the most intense enjoyments, especially when one is very acutely conscious of the hopelessness of one's position. Dostoevsky creates a character who thinks the pursuit of pleasure is dumb and that most people are morons. He's basically surrounded by idiots who go through the ropes and motions of life because of this, kind of lure held in front of them by society, which he rejects and instead pursues a life that is completely bespoke of unique experiences, whether they be pleasurable or not. Again, this would not necessarily be super comprehensible, per se, to Horace or Sir Philip Sidney as the function of literature to essentially defy pleasure. But you could see how Wordsworth is kind of towing up to this more modernist position or setting the stage for it. Okay. Looks like we don't quite have enough room here for T.E. Hume. Works of art aren't eggs. Rather the contrary, it is simply an unfortunate necessity due to the nature of language and technique that the only way the element which does constitute goodness, the only way in which its presence can be detected externally, is by freshness. Real communication is so very rare. Gosh, gotta agree with you there, my friend. For plain speech is unconvincing. It is in this rare fact of communication that you get the root of aesthetic pleasure. Okay, we're into the 20th century now. T.E. Hume is indeed setting the stage for imagism and modernism in general with this essay, where he's comparing Romanticism and Classicism and favoring the classics, or the classicism approach. What are we talking about here? Hume says in order for works to be pleasurable, they must appear fresh, but not in the manner of eggs, in the manner of something else. And this becomes extremely, excuse the pun, bedeviling, deviled eggs. Who knows exactly where this leads? I agree when I read dead, boring language and stuff that's been said before. It doesn't excite me. I like something with vividness and freshness, which I do feel you can get reading older work. Sometimes older work appears to be incredibly vivid and fresh, despite the fact that it was written a long time ago. Freshness to me doesn't seem to be associated with newness. A lot of new stuff is boring to me and does not appear fresh, but how one conveys freshness is extremely difficult to put one's finger on. I don't really know. I don't really know whether I would say freshness is the key for poetry, but certainly an interesting idea here. It's going to center on the image for Hume and for the followers of Hume, like Pound and Eliot. What do you think? What do you think? Okay. Looks like we have more than one quote here. So I guess I made us a little bigger. The death of Satan was a tragedy for the imagination. That's Wallace Stevens in 1947 in a poem, Esthétique du Mal. Satan is an interesting figure. Milton's Satan ends up being this protean creative figure because he elects essentially, after being cast out of heaven for defying God, to create his own world in his own order. and finds it preferable to rule in hell than serve in heaven. And this becomes, in essence, a kind of a model for poetic creativity, the Satan character. We know what we're going to make as poets is doomed. We know that we aren't going to be able to rival nature ultimately, nor are we going to necessarily able to topple the structures and the ideas that came before us. But we have to try. And that small act of rebellion, which we see coming up as this kind of recurring theme here, is an important aspect of being a creative person, right? You need to destroy something in order to make something new. And Wallace Stevens is saying if we imagine an order where nothing is good and nothing is bad, and I guess we kind of, to a certain extent, live in that world, it becomes very difficult to be creative because no act has any particular meaning in such a context. Okay, here we go. I proclaim once more a condition of joy, says Theodore Roethke. We have a figure in late, kind of mid 20th century, I would say kind of after modernism has mostly the kind of the meteoric impact of William Carlos Williams, and Wallace Stevens, and T.S. Eliot. That's all kind of mostly behind us. Here's Roethke saying, I want to return us to a more Wordsworthian frame. I want to go back to a situation where poetry is about joy. Roethke's type of joy is going to be an extremely personal, subjective, internal state of joy, but nevertheless, he's working really hard to get there. It's painstaking, long-suffering work for Roethke. You got to suffer to find joy in Roethke's world. Is it worth it? Don't know, but it's not getting any easier, right? Here we go. We will end then with Glick, our Nobel Prize winner and a poet I admire. And let's see what Glick has to say, given the last word. The real threat to creativity, I put that in brackets because that's the context of this essay. She's writing Fear of Happiness. The real threat to creativity is happiness, which, by removing active unrest, sabotages creative life. See Satan here. Satan doesn't exactly want to be happy. He wants to be in rebellion. Sabotages creative life, which proceeds from an accumulated misery that demands cathartic release. We go all the way back to Horace with that, and Aristotle with the cathartic release, this idea that it has to transport. But what's interesting here is Glick isn't talking about transport for the reader. She's not talking about catharsis for the reader. She's not talking about pleasure for the reader. Glick is talking about her own happiness, her own unrest, that she situates herself as the Satan in rebellion, just as Dostoevsky's hero does. Dostoevsky's hero is in rebellion against this principle that we should do what makes us happy in life, and therefore we should essentially follow the strictures and norms that society gives us. And to be an original in the Dostoevsky mold is to deny this principle. And Louise Glick here is saying, well, in order to succeed as a creative person, I went through this long phase where my own happiness appeared an obstacle, which you could say Roethke's declaration of joy comes with this flip side of a great personal cost for Roethke. She wrote this in 1990. The essay goes on and discusses some other things, how she feels like she's able to find some kind of equilibrium and balance in her life. But nevertheless, I'll put this on to you guys. what is poetry for? Is poetry supposed to give pleasure to the reader? If so, what type of pleasure is that supposed to be? And how do we go about achieving that? Thank you so much for dropping in. It's been really cool to talk with you guys about this. Later on.